Where We're From highlights the rich textures, histories, and experiences of the Asian, Pacific Islander, and Desi American community. Each episode is produced by students at San Jose State University.
Hello, dear viewers and listeners of the podcast, and welcome to the first of many episodes with the banana-flavored minion water, or the BMW for short. We have our hosts, Diana, Mariah, Jason, Taylor, and yours truly, Ray. So, today, in this episode titled The Rock Springs Massacre, A Second Look, we'll be discussing the effects surrounding the event, as well as provide a more in-depth look into both the build-up and the aftermath of it.
To start us off with the Rock Springs Massacre, which took place September 2nd, 1885 in Wyoming Territory. This all began when a fight broke out between white and Chinese miners. During this fight, white men killed one worker and brutally beat another. Instead of ending the fight right there and then, white miners went home to gather guns, hatchets, knives, and clubs, eventually gathering on railroad tracks near Chinatown. Some made an effort to calm things down, but the majority went to the Knights of Labor and met around noon, where 100 to 150 armed white miners and railroad workers eventually surrounded Chinatown. It was a Chinese holiday, so many Chinese workers stayed home, putting themselves more at risk. The mob started, and many Chinese workers were shot and killed, both by men and, surprisingly, women.
Just as you were mentioning, Taylor, following along the riots, any Chinese person who wasn't injured or killed had to leave Rock Springs. Even after the storming mob forced every Chinese person out, they still continued to riot by raiding their houses and setting them on fire. A Chinese council in New York who witnessed this wrote, "The dead bodies of some were carried to the burning buildings and thrown into the flames. Some of the Chinese who had hid themselves in the houses were killed and their bodies burned. Some who on account of sickness could not run were burned alive in the houses." This is something super unimaginable to experience. You're being forced from your home and not being able to look back because everything was set on fire.
So yeah, and expanding on when you were talking about the victims of the genocide, the mob stormed Chinatown, looting and setting homes ablaze. Many Chinese workers faced death and were forced to flee the hills. Eyewitness accounts reveal the horrific reality, with victims being burned alive or thrown into the flames. Some bodies even being found trying to dig their way free, but being overtaken by the fire. J.N. Corbin, Secretary Executive of Union Pacific Employees, states, "From the position of some of the bodies, it could seem as if they had begun to dig a hole in the cellar to try to hide themselves, but the fire overtook them when about halfway in the hole, burning their lower extremities to a crisp and leaving the upper portions of their bodies untouched. Shockingly, no members of the mob faced accountability, underscoring the era's racial injustice. I feel like this tragic event highlights the urgent need to confront the consequences of unchecked racism and mob mentality."
Yeah, and that you mentioned it, that really just goes to show how racial triangulation was present even before the term was coined in modern-day society, because both of them, despite both of them being workers, they were treated as lesser compared to their peers, and then those who wronged the Chinese workers got nothing but a slap on the wrist, which obviously is not right. But you might be wondering to yourself, what had been the build-up to all this? And so, well, before the massacre had occurred, there had actually been reports of anti-Chinese sentiment in the year 1870, back in July. And there was this belief that they should return to their homeland, and these protests furthered the hatred that was felt during that time for the Chinese workers. As mentioned, this is what ended up causing the violent attacks and the murder of them in the first place. But just kind of based on what had happened here, I think it is pretty clear that there's a lot more to it than just a random violent outbreak. You have anything you want to add to that, Jason?
Yeah, absolutely, Ray. In fact, that's a fight had already happened earlier in the day, and it didn't just end it, but increased into something brutal. Really says a lot. This wasn't an isolated event. It was the result of long-term standing, underlying tension. You have their deep root feeling of the residents and the white miner. But what's even more distributing is how quickly that frustration turning into an organized violent attack. The way of violence was carried out, killing 28 Chinese miners, injuring 15, like we just said, and burning down their house. It shows that it was more than just a random fight. It was a planned attack motivated by racial hatred. According to that, you have to wonder, right? At what point does a group of people decide it's okay to take lives and destroy homes like that? It's a terrifying to think about a lack of humanity that went into it. But it's also raises a bigger question about how economic competition and racial hatred can create these kinds of extreme action. What do you think, Taylor? Is there any more ways you think it could be avoided?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the only possible way this event could have been avoided would be if white and Chinese miners were given high enough wages to support their families, and or if more jobs were created, so because so many people needed them. Right. I think earlier you were talking about racial triangulation. Can you please explain what that is?
Yeah, actually. So, racial triangulation is described to be a system where races are compared to each other, with, of course, white people being at the top of the triangle. It's usually used to excuse or to even bring down the other minorities. Like, for example, saying, well, at least the black person is still American. When speaking about Asian workers, it makes them so they're treated as foreign and not American.
Oh, that makes a lot more sense. Thank you for explaining that. I think this actually happened a lot during the Rock Springs Massacre. White people believed it was their right to have jobs over Chinese workers. So when Chinese workers started working in the mines like they were told, white people believed they were taking over their jobs. Due to this, they started killing and brutally injuring many Chinese workers.
I'm glad you guys mentioned this. Many people even now don't know the full context of the phrase Chinese workers taking their jobs. The story about Chinese workers taking white laborers' jobs isn't true at all. What was truly happening was that the railroad work was coming to an end, so they were kicking people out no matter the race. This led to a competition of who can get a job or not. With no work being available, Chinese people were willing to work anywhere for any sort of income, and they did. Their income was very low, but they were working. As white laborers saw this, they started to blame Chinese workers for taking their jobs, but in reality, they just didn't want to work for such a low wage.
Yeah, and I just wanted to talk a little bit more in our current world. Asians and other minorities are belittled with the terms they're stealing our jobs. Chinese workers were attacked by white miners in 1885 because the Chinese, in their eyes, were stealing jobs by accepting cheaper salaries. Similar charges are made when there's an economic downturn, and the anti-Asian prejudice that exists today is a reflection of this mindset. I was reading some historical accounts saying that a similar kind of economic hardship played a part in massacre that resulted in 28 deaths of Chinese laborers and the burning of their houses. I really thought that after all this time, we would have found a better way to live in this country.
Oh, of course. What you just said brings up an important point of how history seems to repeat itself, especially when it comes to economic struggle and racial scapegoating. But beyond the violence itself, we need to consider a long-term lasting effect that the victims and their family, many of those who survived in the massacre, lost everything, homes, property, leaving their rebuilt from scratch. Families were torn apart and entire community were displaced. It is important to remember that these were real people. They're not just names on the history book. Some had to leave the country while others spent years to live in the trauma and fear. Eyewitnesses from that time talk about the panic and fear people left. And even here today, some family were still dealing with the emotion, panic, and the pain and passing down the generation. But anyway, this brings us an important point, how history seems to repeat itself, especially when times taught economically. So, Ray, what do you think? Is there anything you want to add on?
Yeah, well, that you mentioned the fact that history does seem to repeat itself, especially during times of financial hardship. I mean, unfortunately, it just seems like one of those things that are gonna keep happening because we aren't exactly able to do anything to stop it. There's no systems in place to nip these problems at the bud. And so because of that, it just kind of perpetuates this repeated awful disaster of there's limited jobs, economic struggle, people are going to start fighting with each other over the smallest things they can find. And for this case, in a lot of cases, it's commonly race that is the thing that's used as the fighting reason.
But I thank you all for tuning into the first episode with the banana-flavored minion water, and I'm going to go ahead and leave you guys with some questions, for the dear viewers to think about.
What other facts do you think caused this event happen?
Our second question is, why do you think Chinese and white miners' wages were cut by so much during this time?
And like I had alluded to earlier, why wasn't the anti-Chinese sentiment nipped in the bud? But this is a farewell for now, and I hope we see you guys tuning in again soon to our next episode, where we'll be talking about events that are similar to this in modern time. So, bye!
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Where We're From. This podcast is produced by students enrolled in Dr. Joanne Rondilla's Asian American Studies courses at San Jose State University.